Hello everyone and welcome to this In Conversation with Katie Mitchell and Alice Oswald. We brought Katie, who is currently a visiting fellow with the Humanities Cultural Programme, and Alice, who is currently Professor of Poetry. We brought them together here to have a conversation about trees in poetry and on stage, and also in the world. And a conversation about how theatrical and poetic practice might enable us to move between cultures and languages, between time zones, and even between species, to imagine then forms of witness on a kind of experiential scale that might tell us something about the more than human world. We were going to film this in the Japanese section of the Botanical Gardens, since this is happening under the umbrella of the Japan season. Partly to celebrate the 400th year anniversary of the Botanical Gardens, but then both COVID and the weather intervened to change our plans, and so we're enormously grateful to the president of Magdalen College to allow us to decamp here into this wonderful room. I'll now move to say hello to you both. Hello, Alice. Hello, Katie.
Hello.
It's very exciting that this happens to be the first time you've met each other, and that we can have this conversation. I'm going to try and sort of animate things, move things along, but I thought we might start by thinking about a conversation we had in an earlier version of this In Conversation sort of series, where you mentioned that you were thinking of doing, or you are planning to do, a production of The Cherry Orchard from the point of view of the trees. I should tell you that that notion has now gone a bit viral in the environmental network that we have here amongst graduates in particular who are looking at, there's a climate crisis network and there's a reimagining performance network where people are really taken by this idea of reimagining, as it were, classic stories from the point of view of trees and other natural elements within them. And that connects with your lectures, of course, where you think about things, or you've taught us to think about things, to listen to things from the point of view of pebbles, from the point of view of rivers, stones, and so on. So I wondered if we might just start there, which is tell us a bit about why you thought it would be interesting to tell the cherry orchard from the point of view of the trees, and then we'll pick up with the other bits. And as I say, I'm happy to disappear into the background of this conversation.
Oh, it's lovely
whenever
to have you
guys.
present.
Well, yeah, but you know, tell us. Start by there.
Okay, well, I suppose I've been doing a lot of work in the last sort of 10 years on Eco-Dramaturgy, which is the sort of intersection between ecology and theatre. And I have been doing work with scientists, putting them on stage, and they've been talking about the science. I've been treating other canonical works like Samuel Beckett's Happy Days in an environmental way. But I realised that in none of the pieces of work that I've been doing am I able to escape the anthropocentric element of what theatre seems to be. So all the time, the meaning resides in the human characters. And so I was really searching for a way to dislodge that centrality and to take a canonical piece and view it from the point of view of the more than human world, which seems to be the most important and precious focus to have at the moment. And so I had directed already the Cherry Orchard, and I thought, what would it be like to do it from the point of view of the trees? And of course, it's very anti-theatrical because tree time is so slow. And so it's like, if you literally watched tree time, I think the audience would leave quite quickly. It's very, very boring. But there's some part of me that wants to engage the audience with tree time. So the idea is not fully shaped. It's a project for the Hamburg Schauspielhaus in Germany, where the German audiences are able to accept more radical experimentation. And at the moment, I'm in the process of working out how much of the human moments are going to actually be present in the piece. Maybe we'll cut 88% of the play, and we'll just be from the point of view of the orchard. But I think I spoke to you about it, Alice, and the question you were asking me, which was the most important question, was what's the language going to be? And that's something that I think I'm struggling with. And just to finish off, to say that I'm thinking to do it backwards. So we do it from the orchard being cut down, and then we go back through the play, and then we exit the play and we go back in time, maybe to when the orchard was planted, and then back in time and maybe when that ancient forest was cleared so that the industrial orchard could be planted, and then even back further in time, right the way through to when the first tree occurred in the Carboniferous period. Because I discovered that we only do human time on stage, and it would be great also to attempt geological time, all of which I think will empty all theatre houses. Really, really challenging.
Yeah.
But of course, in our sort of conversation by email that we had, of course, you went straight to the sort of, heart of the matter, which is what is the language of the performance going to be, and that is something that is completely uncertain at the moment.
Yeah, one thing I noticed when I was hurriedly rereading the play yesterday was that actually I think most of the characters are already speaking in tree language, because they seem to have this way of speaking that doesn't actually get anywhere, all except Lopakin, is that how you pronounce him? He's in kind of this forward-moving kind of tree-felling type of language, but the rest of them are actually sort of on the same wavelength as the cherry trees, I think, and I think that's their kind of their problem and their sort of their comic trap, is that they aren't actually moving forward. And so I was quite interested in the idea. I've always been interested in those moments when theatre first emerged from chorus to protagonist, and that thing of the actor stepping out. So I'm kind of seeing it at the moment as, Lopakin, who's speaking the kind of forward-moving language, having to step back into the chorus, and how that would be if in some way that kind of directionality that he has is taken away and you take it back to those sort of first beginnings of theatre, which I think are in some way close. I think humans contain inside them a kind of vegetable language as well as a mineral language and an animal language and all kinds of different languages, and that poetry in particular is able to rediscover that vegetal language.
And when we were chatting on email, you talked about, was it seeds growing backwards, is that right? And then you also talked about something really, really interesting, the idea of when you drown, everything goes backwards, this idea of backwards motion.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I was really curious. It was like one little statement, and then so I wanted to understand a bit more. Because I did say to you, I think at one point, I said, well, what would happen if they all spoke backwards as well? And you were very kind about my appalling idea.
No, I think it's a really interesting idea, and I think the first thing to think is there are many ways of speaking backwards, and you can speak word by word backwards, sound by sound backwards, phrase by phrase backwards, paragraph by paragraph backwards. You can take whatever unit you want, and the first thing that seems important to me is that words were only invented quite recently, and before writing existed, the phrase was the unit. So I would at least want to say, retain the coherence of the phrase, because the phrase is where coherence begins. The word is it's a recent and sort of atomic and weird structure, I think. So I love the idea of phrase by phrase taking it backwards. And I also, because I have a slight kind of disability with narrative, and for me the only way I can really understand narrative is to look at seeds, because I think they are perfect units of story. They contain in them the whole of the plot of the future plant, but they also kind of contain the sort of every previous generation of plant within them. So they are, perfect plotting mechanisms. And so I suppose to sort of listen into how a seed is constructed would give one a beginning of thinking about how things might naturally move backwards as opposed to cerebrally move backwards. Because I think one wouldn't want to sort of enter it and actually just impose another human structure and saying, okay, now let's play
That's
it backwards.
right. And I'm very curious that when you say disability with narrative, what's that about? What does that mean? Is it as an organising principle? Is it the way that people use narrative as an organising principle that you can't relate to, or I'm really
I
intrigued?
think because my medium is above all poetry, and because poetry is basically constructed out of repetition, I have sort of trained myself not to move forwards in some ways. So I absolutely love language that just goes round and round in circles. And I can't read novels, except a very few. And I tend always to respond to things. Well, an analogy I could make is I recently learnt that John Cage said that the way music might move forward now is through timbre rather than sort of tune and pitch. And I thought that was a really good description of how I would like language to move forward. That you can think of tune as narrative because it kind of seems to get somewhere. But timbre simply expresses material, really. And it's it doesn't have to get somewhere. It just goes on expressing what's there. Does that make sense? And I think poetry is that kind of timbre, really.
Completely. All I'm thinking as you're talking, of course, I'm a maker, I'm working out how to take these ideas and translate them into something we could actually see. And I wondered, when... do you think that if we go back to the cherry orchard, that the thing to lean into would be how the characters speak, or to find an entirely new language for how the trees speak?
I imagine these things would require some kind of experiment and devising in the first place, so that I don't think one should necessarily go into it knowing how those questions could be answered. And I'm pretty sure you wouldn't be trying to kind of invent a tree language, because I think that's always unsuccessful. While I think it's the most brilliant idea to tell it from the tree's point of view, I also think you're expecting a human audience to come, and therefore the language needs, in some way, to be a middle point rather than going to one extreme. So I would certainly think that using some elements of human meaning and human understanding would give it something. But whether you enter into sort of the whole world of communicating through sound, sort of either music or noise, you've got the twang and the axe knock in the play already. So those would seem quite interesting things to explore, let alone all the rustlings that trees
It's just that if you basically are really strict and you focus what happens in the cherry orchard, not much of the play actually happens in the cherry orchard. So I think to begin with, you'd have dawn coming up, and then someone would open a window for a few seconds, and if you're strict, and they say a few words that you would indistinctly hear, and then it would shut. Then a gardener would walk through with a bunch of flowers. And then later on in the second act, a few people crash through the orchard on the way elsewhere. So it would leave us with a lot of times when there aren't human beings there, and we're just there with the trees. And there's the challenge for the theatre. That's a challenging moment. And I think you're absolutely right to say there shouldn't be, like, a language of trees could be really naff and embarrassing. But the question is, when we're with them, what are we with before the next sort of wave of human beings sort of crash through? Remains sort of unsolved, I think.
Well, I love the way it seems to me that Chekhov has already caught the peripheral language of trees. Actually, trees are sort of choric beings, and what they say is always slightly marginal. It's always kind of, you catch it through a window, or even if you're right underneath a tree, you don't necessarily get to the centre of it speaking. So I think keeping the sort of peripheral and half-caught quality would be a really important aspect of it.
Can I go back to something you said at the beginning, which is that in returning to the play, it seemed to you that some of the characters were already speaking tree language? Because I think I felt that too. And in particular, this sort of obsessive return to some earlier stage of their existence, which they were then bringing into the present. So basically recollection, but as a way of trying not so much to move forward, but to bring the past into the present and to make it part of the conversation. That struck me as not dissimilar to your kind of notion when you said about the seeds unfolding forwards by remembering backwards. It seems to me that the characters are doing a bit of that, or quite a lot of the characters. Now, you're right, that there's one who isn't, and that's the choric and the individual thing there. But I think there's something to be said for allowing at least some of the, as part of the experiment, allowing some of the recollection that's going on to be to recognise that as tree language too, as this circular, the rings. I mean, I'm being very blunt, but in the way in which trees are constructed of histories on histories on histories that are nonetheless all present, as well as being in the past. And it strikes me that Chekhov's onto that right from the beginning. And again, I'd just not seen that before, heard that before, until I was starting to think about it from the point of view of the trees.
But you're so lovely because you don't want to dismantle the original written artefact. And some part of me willfully goes, well, let's just dismantle it and face the problem of trying to make trees really dynamic theatrically, which is an impossible problem because they can't be, because nothing particular will happen necessarily, or maybe a lot of things will happen as we are invited into tree time, which is a much slower time, so perhaps things will happen.
Having said that I don't like narrative, I actually recently heard a telling of the most extraordinary story from, I think, a Sequana tribe in North America, which is all about, it's called The Listener, and it's about 3 generations, an old man, a young man, and 2 twins. And the young man is told by the old man to go and sit under a tree for 7 years and listen. And it's a very kind of slow, unfolding way the story is told. He listens and he listens and he listens. And finally it gets to the point where he hears something, and what he hears is some music, and the music is from a canoe, and in the canoe there's a young woman and an old woman. And it's told at great length, but to cut a story short, the young man follows the canoe. The old woman is endlessly taunting him and testing him and throwing urine at him and bones and stones. But he kind of gets through all these trials, marries the young woman, loses his eyesight, borrows the eyes of animals, shoots them with a crooked arrow in a state of blindness, has 2 children, they recover his eyes. They then go round the world telling the story of their father, and in travelling around the world, they go back to the old man, tell him the story. He recognises that it's the young man he sent out, and asks the twins to take him to the old woman, and marries the old woman. So it's this extraordinary kind of condensed narrative about 3 generations, which are all in some way kind of implicated in each other. And that seems to me quite a sort of a beautiful portrait of the sort of recollection and futuristic language all sort of happening together. So I think there are sort of stories where people are used to listening to trees and kind of speaking in tune with that. But it tends to be that our stories are all quite out of tune with it, I think.
But I'm talking about out of tuneness. Isn't it part of the reason for wanting to do the production is, of course, the planetary emergency that we're all sort of facing, and so the wish to sort of look at canonical things and dismantle them in order to have a conversation with that awful reality. I just wonder what your experiences are of the planetary emergency, both as someone who's, because I'm really aware that you work a lot of the time in gardens, which is such a beautiful place to be. It's a place that I would like to be most, I think, much more than in a theatre. But I was curious. I felt it was something we didn't touch on in our correspondence.
It's a huge and problematic question, I think, because on the one hand, you have to answer it in great detail by talking about heat pumps and economics and various other things like that. On the other hand, as I'm not an expert in those fields, I genuinely believe there is a contribution to be made to sort of altering how the imagination works. Because I think all human behaviour ultimately derives from the pictures we have in our minds of what the world is and what we are. So I think tweaking that and listening to a sort of more accurate picture of that is probably the best thing I can do. But I also think there's a great danger in kind of going on shouting and thinking one has done one's bit simply by shouting. And actually, you know, we have to address it in the imagination, but we also have to do whatever we can in practical terms to help.
Yeah, no, I so agree. It's just been really for the last sort of 10 years since I encountered through the work with a scientist all of the information. And obviously I was brought up in the 1970s in the self-sufficiency movement, so I have sort of always the reference to people like Rachel Carson there in my mind. But I was just reflecting on how we approach it as artists. And I think what you were saying is really, really apt, which is that we have to help reframe people's imagination. I think that's a beautiful way to put it, and to encourage a new way of looking at the world. And I suppose that's part of the task with the cherry orchard from the point of view of the trees, as with lots of other environmental projects that I've been working on. Is how to do that in a non-forceful, non-aggressive way, I think.
I mean, it goes back to what you were saying about decentering the human perspective, and the sort of finding another way, another subject in the sense of the main character, either for a story or indeed for a poem. And of course, you've been doing that for some time through both through your lectures as part of the Professor of Poetry, but also through your poetry. And it seems to me that, again, what we're not talking about here is nature poetry.
Thank you.
Thank heavens you said that. Thank heavens.
No, but I think it's important because people misunderstand and think, okay, yeah, that we're still talking about sort of wandering through and finding it all very beautiful. You're absolutely not. So can I just ask you to say why we're not talking about nature poetry? In the same way as you were able to say, well, I'm not just doing a production of Chekhov, there's something else going on here. I think it's a similar gesture. You're not doing nature poetry, so in a sense, why not?
I mean, I think the simplest answer to that is the very word nature already puts you outside it. It's a kind of modern invention. And I think one also needs to talk about, you know, the human is implicated and human power structures are implicated. So actually a lot of what needs to happen is, you know, thinking about the human, but in sort of repositioning the human within your expression, the more than human world, is probably, well, that's the work I'm interested in, I think. What about you?
Yeah, definitely. But it's really, really challenging to do it. And I think it's very challenging to do it in my art form, which is theatre, which is, as you will know, won't you, better than anyone, the invention of naturalism linked to the Industrial Revolution, the whole thing about being in these darkened rooms, which are all about anthropocentric stories wasting masses of electricity, each production just thrown in the bin afterwards. I think it's very, very hard to tackle it in the theatre. It may be actually a bit easier to do it with poetry, I would say, because it sort of undermines the whole procedure. So I've spent this year doing bike-powered performance. So even we did one at the Royal Festival Hall. We had 16 cyclists, stationary bikes, powering the lights for the orchestra and the sound system. And we even got the soprano on her own bike. She was singing whilst cycling to power the electricity, which is really exciting. So I'm sort of trying to look at new sort of forms to energise a little bit the conversation. And also it can be an incredibly depressing conversation, particularly for the younger generation, which I'm really sort of mindful of. So as well as doing things like the cherry orchard from the point of view of the trees, I think it's really lovely to do other investigations which push forward into new forms, so that the crises is about expansion, not contraction. That seems to be sort of forcing you into a new creative territory, as opposed to feeling that you're sort of having to be overwhelmed and reducing the creativity. So that's something that I find really interesting.
Yeah, and what you're engaging there is also with the means of production, the sort of forms, yes, but also the actual kind of business, the matter of making something. Now, like you, now we may just be ignorant about this, Alice, I think that's all easier in poetry, because basically it's, you know, you and some words. But is that true?
Well, poetry's impossible. I think that I think that it's not poetry unless it's impossible, and you have to kind of get through some major obstruction every time you sit down to write a poem. Yeah. So I'm not going to say it's easier. And I'm particularly interested anyway in the performance of poetry, because I think poetry becomes something quite different when there's a living person speaking it. Mm-hmm. And as with theatre, you need a certain amount of control of your space in order to be able to communicate that well. I mean, I'm often asked, will I recite Dart next to the Dart? And how do you recite a poem about a river with the river doing it much better beside you? So, you know, that aspect you've spoken of you've got somehow to make a controlled space. Mm-hmm. And how do you do that without wasting electricity or whatever? I think those questions arise as well. But I have always loved the fact that to write a poem, you really only need a biro, or actually you really only need your own memory. So that the kind of self-sufficiency is something that I really love. And a play doesn't actually come into being until it's embodied in actors and it's got an audience. So I acknowledge there are some material differences.
Definitely material differences. Very, very challenging.
But they always have been, and really should be, very close cousins, if not sisters, theatre and poetry. And I just love watching how the Greek tragedies kind of came out of Homer. You know, that you can see them sort of interacting, and you can find Aeschylus inside Homer. You can find, you can always find those interactions between plays and poems. And actually since we're in this Japan season, am I right in thinking that the no plays derived from Chinese ballads, mostly, Chinese kind of narrative poems? So there is always, and always should be, that conversation. And I feel quite sad that possibly there's less of that going on now between theatre and poetry. Perhaps I'm just ignorant.
Well, perhaps we should start something.
I was going to say.
Yeah. I think we definitely should. I think that would be a really exciting time. And also the time of this challenge of the planetary emergency, I think it's great that art forms become more porous. I think it's really important we don't hold our territory in the way that we have in the past, and we need to look for a new porosity. But did you read Ben Okri a couple of weekends ago in The Guardian, who was writing about existential creativity? And he was saying that it was that every word that he writes needs to be conscious of the fact that it's written at the end of time. And I was really struck by, I know, it was like a manifesto, fantastic manifesto. And I was really struck by his courage, because he's putting himself in the place that I can only wander to for a few minutes in a day. I couldn't hang out there for very long, imagining the reality as it is like that. What do you think about that, the idea that we're in a time of existential creativity? Or maybe, like me, you think we always were in a time of existential creativity.
I cynically was thinking, I wonder how many writers have thought they're at the end of time. You know, maybe it is kind of a natural thing to think. I suppose with poetry, you know, that the form itself takes you into a kind of dream time, if you like. You kind of exit linear time when you're in the medium of poetry. So kind of ideas like ends and beginnings don't have such meaning. But it's definitely a good thought experiment, I think, to think, okay, you know, who am I writing towards if it's the end of time? And, you know, how can I live up to the urgency of that? You know?
I worry about the end of time hypothesis as a kind of, to go back to what you were saying about young people, but as a kind of fantasy of people growing old, thinking, right, we're it. There is no future. And I know that's not what he means, but there's a lot of that about. There's a lot of the kind of, sorry kids, but we've ruined the world for you, and it's finished. And that doesn't leave much agency for them.
No, you are so right to say that.
I wondered if we might think about that.
I mean, what's wonderful is that as soon as you start working with the imagination, you just, the imagination is endlessly productive and creative and highly optimistic. So, you might think these things when you're thinking about what to write about, but as soon as you engage with a project, my experience is you get incredibly excited, and you can't help, thinking forwards as well as backwards. And I'm very against the sort of note of nostalgia and sorrow that I think has kind of crept into the arts, because actually that's generally a sign that you're on the edge of the imagination rather than going right into it.
Yeah,
But thank you for reminding us.
Yeah, I think that's really important to be reminded of that. And it just feels like things are contracting, let's say. But as you say, I think it's therefore, the contraction is a transition or a threshold, isn't it, into new creativity. So I suppose I liked reading what Ben Okri had written, but like you, I felt I want to forge forwards beyond this place. And the privilege I found of lockdown was all my career collapsed. Is you could keep writing. Everything stopped for me, which was great, a real blessing actually. And I was able to plant things. I grew a lot of things actually. That was the first thing I did. I got all these seeds and I started to grow things. So that was the first thing that I did. And the second thing, I thought, well, what should I do with my time? I thought, I'll teach. And that's what I taught people. And of course, it was amazing to be in contact with that generation, the younger generation, and what they feel about what's going on. And as I think you said earlier, it's not only about environmental matters. There's an intersection with Black Lives Matter or Me Too or the awful events around Sarah Everard. So there's a real sort of rupture time, isn't it? When all of these sort of tectonic plates, if you like, are sort of really grating. And I think creatively, although it may feel oppressive, it's also a huge time of opportunity and possible optimism, which seems strange to say, but I do think it is.
Yeah,
We've got to find the right forms.
Mostly young people are excited. I think they're very switched on and definitely making stuff. And so it's very energising to kind of talk to them and work with them, I think.
Great thing.
Now we're back talking about humans, aren't we? So we started talking about trees, but I don't mean when we come down to it, but when we start thinking about action or agency or things to do, things that can be done, we end up with forms of social agency, social organisation, whether it's a theatre as a kind of social unit, people working together, or of course a poetic performance as also an intervention that's also in a social world, which of course takes us back to Chekhov, the beginning. I mean, certainly the opening play, there's all sorts of different kinds of time, but also social action imagined in there. So I want to go back to the play and say, even if it's from the point of view of the trees, you're going to have some people in there wanting things, doing things, hoping things, or not.
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean,
Okay.
I was actually very secretly pleased when you talked about your relationship to narrative, because I've really struggled with linear narrative, as you know, Wes. I don't think it's a good way of organising my experience of being alive or perception or reality in any way. So I really struggle with the idea of one person, normally a man, heads out into a story, various things happen, and that person ends up happy or sad. It seems miles away from any experience I have of being alive. So I find it, as an organising principle, I'm really sort of challenged by it. So I think I will probably shatter the play. And so you may see fragments of those hopes and dreams, but I think only fragments, because I'm interested in the trees. And maybe there'll be the odd moment where we see the relationship, but the emotion hopefully will reside in the relationship between a character and a tree. That would be my dream. So there might be moments which aren't in the play, but we'll imagine maybe where one of the characters will sit with a tree for a bit or hug a tree or whatever it is. I don't know. That sounds very cheesy, but I am trying to force myself into a different place, which is miles from the linear narrative of the original play. But maybe that's erroneous.
But you've gone and chosen a play in which famously nothing actually happens. So
the trees get cut down?
Yeah, okay. So but within a social frame, there isn't much linear narrative there anyway.
No.
But you're right. Something happens, and that is that trees get cut down.
But there's also something, there's a shadow behind the play, which is the drowning of the sun.
Yeah.
Which I think is something that often productions lose a little bit about that. And there's something about nature, that river, and the death of a child, as well as that cherry orchard, which sort of cooks inside the piece. So
Yep.
I also thought the cherry orchard would be the site through which, if you're moving back in time, the child is carried after that event. So I think there's a river in the background, very near, and with all the power and danger and complexity that is a river.
Yep.
I think that would be something also that we could, from the point of view of the trees plus the river, maybe we could add the river.
You've thought about rivers, Alice.
Famously, that most
I love
beautiful
rivers,
poem.
and we mentioned already this fact that apparently when people drown, they see their lives backwards. So immediately, one is thinking of the child kind of living that life of the trees backwards.
Because earlier we talked about seed syntax. I mean, there must be a river syntax too, or
well, rivers. Rivers are very good narrators because they actually do have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So
and they make a noise.
And they make a noise, but they also. I mean, I wrote Dart using the river's narrative, but I was very struck when I then came to perform it and use it with the fact that there were whole other things that I hadn't included, like the sort of the time dimension. What happens when it's a different season to the river? What happens when the tide's in or when the tide's out? So rivers might appear to have one linear narrative, but actually they've got all sorts of different things going on that you can follow as well.
Time is something we've been sort of talking about all the way through this conversation, and I thought as we get towards the last phase of it, we might think more explicitly about time. And as you said, rivers have different temporalities according to seasons. Again, in the play, the seasons matter a lot in the play. And like you said right at the beginning, in relation to a staging of the play, theatrical time is very demanding. People expect something. I mean, they don't necessarily know exactly what they want, but they know that, within this space of sitting down and watching, something will happen, or there'll be some change in the state of the world. I'll come back to that question in a minute, but do you have a sense of that when you're writing a poem, that there's a kind of temporal frame for the poem itself that imposes itself on you? Does a poem take its own time, is I guess what I'm asking, or is that not part of what you think about when you live?
A poem it's a fascinating mechanism because a poem comes alive whenever it enters the present moment, and that's easy enough in a short poem. When you're writing a long poem, you're basically having to kind of construct a machine for perpetuating the present moment. So I always think that a long poem and a short poem are actually the same length, really, because they're both of them occupying one instant at their best. So I think questions of time are sort of irrelevant when it comes to poetry, and poems they are sort of clocks. They create their own time within them. That's how their rhythms work, and they put your mind into a different time zone, I think. And that's why I think probably poetry would always be the language I'd choose if I was trying to understand the animal or vegetable kingdom, because you're already not in the human time frame.
And how is time when you're performing your poetry? How's your experience when it moves from just that writing process with the biro to actually performing it? How does time feature when you're performing it?
It's really, really strange, particularly if I'm performing a long poem like Memorial, which I know lasts about an hour, and I frequently use it on, I used to use it on plane trips because I'm very scared of flying, and so I knew that if I recited it back to back, I could get through time as if I were inventing it myself. So it kind of gave me back some control of the aeroplane. And it's a very odd thing to recite from memory over an hour. You begin to feel time as a kind of substance rather than just an abstract idea. And you're sort of moving through it, and you can dimly kind of see the end of it, but it's much more material than it is when one thinks about time in terms of sort of days and timetables and things. But that's probably similar to a play.
I think so. It sounds more unique, actually. And I'm thinking about a time when I persuaded an actor, Stephen Delane, to learn T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets and perform that.
Yeah.
At the first half of the evening. The second half, we did the Beethoven String Quartet, which had inspired the poem. And I just remember that actually the performance of poetry, which we did in the theatre, which is an unusual place to do it, with all the lights, everything we know is music, it just took the audience to a very different place. I just remember that the sense of time was really shifted and altered because the organising principles are so different. And it was a very, very exciting piece of work to do. I thought it might not work at all because that's quite a long thing. But it really shifted the audience's relationship to time.
I mean, in a way, it's what music does anyway, isn't it? And that's what I think that's what I find so fascinating about poetry, is that it's both using the sort of forward-moving language that we all use towards each other, but then its sound is just doing something quite different. So you're always listening with two different selves, really.
I'm just thinking that for this moment now, it may be quite interesting to take poetry into theatres because of what we're trying to absorb such a complex change that's going on, that it may be the one of the best routes to grasping it. Yeah.
Well, I definitely think that, and I think this whole idea that prose is more realistic is just rubbish because what is real? Is it the sort of matter of fact things prose can say, or is it a more complex and sort of resonant structure that poetry can say?
I think that if you do that, you can also grasp something of the non-anthropomorphic or anthropocentric, because poetry isn't attached to character in the same way as theatre is. I mean, I'm not saying that you can't have characters in poems, and of course in Dark you have characters too, and so on, but I think there's a kind of disembodied but also re-embodied in the sort of flow, the sound, the timbre of language itself and everything that comes from, the choric, if you like, in a poetic person speaking on stage that frees you from being the character who's socially embedded in or socially constructed in these various different ways, or for at least the time that's happening. Am I making sense? Yeah.
Totally. I was having the same thought.
Okay, well, that doesn't necessarily make it right, but it means at least the two of us. No, I mean, two people that, but there is something about that it probably is reaching right back into, as you say, where theatre comes from. If the language is not kind of just me as character speaking.
And I think it's good to do both. We have got somewhere with it. Let's not reject all of theatre because it's it's incredible. But just to begin to hear the other at the same time would be a really.
Well, I just think it's a time for new forms and new languages. Probably. I've just done a piece which I mentioned to you earlier, where we're doing 4 actors with 4 microphones, and they're representing thoughts inside a young woman's head as she manages the experience of sexual assault. And there's something, to begin with, the audience are a bit disappointed, nothing seems to be happening. But actually everything is happening and you're invited into someone's consciousness. So maybe that's where our conversation will head. We'll leave this lovely conversation we're having you in Oxford, and Alice and I may head off and make something where poetry and theatre come together.
But let's not even call it poetry or theatre. I mean, I really like, ideas like, I always use the word sound carving to myself, because I just think that immediately means I can do what I want. It doesn't need to be something that somebody else has an idea about.
Yeah, good call.
Okay.
I think that's a good place to stop.
Yeah.
An imagined future of something that you guys make.
And we're serious.
I'm serious too, and I'll help it happen.
Cool.
And the idea of a sound carving is really, really nice. Thank you so much, Alice. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks,
And thank you everybody out there for watching and listening. That's the last of the In Conversation events for this term, and indeed for the Japan season. So, yeah, goodbye.